and welcome to Always Take Notes.
This week's episode is brought to you by Reedsy, the world's top marketplace for publishing professionals.
Whether you're writing your first book or your fifth, Reedsy can help you take a real step into the world of publishing.
On their site, you'll find professional editors who have worked on everything from best-selling children's books to presidential memoirs and Booker-winning novels.
You can hire them as book coaches to guide you through the writing process, get detailed developmental notes to shape your next draft, or bring in a top-tier copy editor to polish your prose.
Browse through thousands of hand-picked editors from around the world, put together your shortlist, and start getting quotes today.
And, for listeners of Always Take Notes, Reedsy is offering $50 off your first collaboration when you sign up at reedsy.com/loves/notes.
That's reedsy.com/loves/notes.
Sign up today and give your book the best chance at success. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself speak with the novelist Eimear McBride.
We spoke to Eimear about her early interest in acting and love of Russian literature, about experimenting with style and earning comparisons to James Joyce, and about her latest novel, The City Changes Its Face.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Eimear, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Can't we start with your new book, The City Changed Its Face? You pick up the story of Eileen and Stephen, who first appeared in The Less Bohemians in 2016. You've said that you weren't done with them. Why were you not done with them?
Oh, I think they're just the most interesting people I know. And even when I was writing Lesser Bohemians, I kept having kind of flashes of scenes that I knew didn't really fit within the time frame of that novel, which takes place over the course of one academic year. And I knew these were sort of ideas that would be later on, things that would happen later on in a relationship. And so really, when I finished it, Lesser Bohemians, I wanted to start on City straight away, but other things got in the way. So that's why it's taken a while to return to them.
And you have these different timelines which then come together, so now and first summer. When you were writing the book, did you write it as it appears in print or in sections and then bring it together subsequently?
I mean, largely as it appears in print, because I always write, in a straight line, because I start with kind of complete unknowing about what I'm going to be writing about. In this case, I knew the characters, but that was it. I didn't know what would happen or what the book would be about. And originally, I thought it would maybe just be the now time stream, which takes place over the course of one night in Camden in 1996. But as I began to write it, I realised that actually, of course, when you're writing about two people in a relationship stuck in a room together, whatever past they share is going to become present very, very quickly. And it's hard for the reader to become engaged with them if they don't also know what that past is.
And why did you want to pick up kind of only 2 years later? I feel like sometimes when novelists return to characters, they want to have a big kind of jump ahead. Was it that you just felt that it was natural to carry on more or less from where you'd left off? Or what was the reasoning with kind of following on?
They were obviously going to have quite an eventful 2 years, given where the relationship is at the end of Lesser Bohemians, that there was going to be quite a lot of things that would happen. And also I was interested in that kind of near time stream of a relationship that's becoming a long-term relationship. That, we're not at 10 years later where they're kind of driving each other around the bend, but they're kind of moving from that moment when it's all kind of excitement and passion and shagging into, who's going to do the dishes and, where's the council tax bill and that the intimacy that develops around banality.
Talking of shagging, you're often lauded for writing well about sex, and it is a notoriously difficult thing. What is your approach both in The City Changes Its Face and elsewhere?
That it has to serve a purpose that's more than just decorative, or that's more than just a plot point after which things change, that it's really about character. And that's what makes it interesting for me to write about, and makes it, I think, the way I write about it a bit different to the traditional way, because for me the writing has to be incredibly specific. So that meant when I first started writing lots of sex and Lesser Bohemians, I realised that I had to forbid myself use of all the traditional kind of sex words, all the kind of thrusting and grinding and pumping and all that stuff that we, that we're accustomed to writing, using, expecting in sex scenes. And that really, I wanted the reader to feel as though when you got to the end of a sex scene, you understood something more about who these people were and how they were transformed and changed by that experience in big ways and in really small and banal ways as well. And I wanted to weave those changes and that evolution through the growth of their both kind of emotional relationship and their sexual relationship. And so all the time I'm very careful to keep it close to who Eilidh is, why she's responding as she is, what she's experiencing in that room, who Stephen is, what he's responding to. It can't be, I hope, it never feels like it could be anyone in that room. It always has to feel as though it is only those two people.
That's really interesting, because I feel like that's a conversation that's been happening in parallel in the kind of film world, especially with the use of intimacy coordinators. There's a lot more emphasis on what's the role of this sex scene in the story, how should the characters be positioned, not literally, and also literally. Do you feel that that's something that fiction is somewhat lagged behind in, or do you just feel that it's something that you in particular wanted to focus on in your writing?
I mean, it is something that I particularly was interested in and am interested in, but I also think that it is a problem in literature. And I think, it comes out of, that long tradition of censorship and then prudery and then fear of getting it wrong in case you get nominated for the Bad Sex Award. I think everything is going against writing well about sex in our culture. And now the sort of terror that somehow you will insult or violate someone by writing about sex or trigger them in some way. And I think that has led to a lot of very bad writing and a lot of unwillingness for people to kind of push the envelope in terms of how they're dealing with sex and the ways that they're exploring it through language. Yeah, and I suppose because it seemed to me such an interesting way to explore character and such an unliterary way to explore character and using language to describe such an unintellectual experience, that there was a kind of a challenge there, and there was an opportunity to do something that nobody else was really doing.
I saw elsewhere you'd mentioned that you've kind of had a changing perspectives to D.H. Lawrence as, a archetypal writer about sex, finding Lady Chatterley's Lover very kind of powerful when you first got at it, and then kind of reassessing your view of him, particularly regarding his politics and stuff like that. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first time I read Lawrence, I was about 16, and so this would have been the early 90s in Ireland, coming out of very deeply and profoundly religious conservative childhood. And Lawrence kind of blew it apart. Lady Chatterley's Lover was incredibly exciting and brave and was engaging with the body and the kind of sexual desire in a way that I had never experienced before. And that was very liberating to me as a young woman at that point in my life. But as the years have gone by, I find him incredibly tedious. I find the language itself really exhausting. I find his books very overwritten. I find his attitudes towards women are actually kind of appalling. For all his, lauding of sexual desire, it's not really. Women are they're still like Henry Miller beasts or something going. I find the writing also, just even beyond the politics, just the repetitive tediousness of his prose, impossible to wade through these days.
I, not that long ago, waded through Sons and Lovers on a holiday, and it felt like a punishing experience. In terms of your own storytelling style, it's something that is very distinctive, and on display in this book as well. How have you developed that voice, and how would you describe it of your own kind of particular style?
Well, I suppose I see myself as a very unliterary kind of writer. I'm not interested in engaging with the novel and the world of the novel and what it should be, so much as bypassing all the traditions of what we think novels should be and can achieve, and trying to create a much more physical, visceral experience of language in the novels and of the characters, and of trying to make myself as the author be entirely absent from the reader's experience of the novel. I mean, of course, I've written it. It's only there because of me, but I don't want the reader to think about me at all. I want them only to experience what's going on between them and the character. And in three of my books, so not Strange Hotel, but in Girl is Avram Thing, Lesser Bohemians and City, that's very much, dealing with the book is read through the consciousness of those characters, and I've always tried to make it seem to the reader as though those experiences were happening inside them, that they weren't processing them in an intellectual or external way, but that they were simply forced through those experiences along with those characters, and then later on they can bring all their various critical faculties into the equation, but that in that moment of reading they're not really engaged with the writing so much as the emotional, physical, visceral experience of the character.
You've touched on this a bit already, but can we fold back now to your early life? And I was touched by an account you gave of your dad teaching you to read, and you resisted this because you said you already knew how to talk, which seemed a very kind of sound point. But tell us about moving from Liverpool to rural Sligo, and the kind of experience of your early life, and where books and writing and reading really fitted into that.
So I was born in Liverpool. My parents were both Northern Irish and had spent, the previous 10 years or so working in the north of England with my two elder brothers. But they had always wanted to come back to Ireland, but not to the north at that point in the early 80s because of the Troubles. And my father got a job in a facility for people with mental disabilities, and he was a nurse. And in County Sligo. So we ended up coming to Sligo, which none of us knew, had no experience of, and small town life in Tubbercurry was, you were reminded constantly that you were on the outside of the world, that you did not belong. And I think reading fitted very neatly into that, and certainly felt like a big part of that separation experience. It wasn't something that was, that my friends at school were interested in. But yeah, so my father, it was very important to him that we all learned to read early on. So he had left school at 14. So for him, it was very, very important that we all learned to read. And he taught me when I was about 3. Yes, so I read a lot as a child, and I often read things that my older brothers would have read. So there were books that we had in the house. And it was certainly something that was very emphasised in the house. Like, there wasn't a lot of money, but if you wanted a book, there was always a way to get it. And so that was kind of my early life, and my parents read widely. But my mother was the person who was much more interested in language, in being playful with language, and lots of kind of made up words and kind of interesting dialect constructions and things like that went on. Yeah, so that was the beginning, I suppose.
I saw in other interviews that you discovered literature and translation as a teenager. Can you remember where that interest came from, and in particular the interest in Russian literature?
Well, again, I think there was things in the house. So my older brother was sort of reading Solzhenitsyn, so it was there to pick off the shelf. But also, I think I remember seeing a documentary about Russia. This would have been kind of mid-80s. And I found it really fascinating. I found all the atheism amazing, considering the religious environment in which I was growing up. And that sort of drew me to Russia, which then, in those days, you couldn't look it up on the internet. The way to access other worlds was through literature, was through books. And then, of course, once you begin to read, that's just an experience that extends and branches and introduces you to new things, and you end up traveling around the world. And for me, that was a way of finding out about the world, quite literally. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. It was a way of realizing that there were people out there who were not like me, and how they lived and what they thought.
I saw elsewhere as well that you said that kind of books sort of took you into Russia, and you had this quite kind of sunny view of Soviet communism, and then later it was books as well that kind of disabused you of it. I forget the particular title, but I think you mentioned there was a particular book that kind of convinced you that it wasn't all as rosy as you thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was that kind of very naive, romantic notion of, socialism and the wonders that it offered, and the equality that it gave to all people in all lands that embraced it. And and that is a young person's view of that. And later on, of course, once you read about the horrors of the Soviet Union, you get quite a different experience. And I think maybe the book you mean is Nadezhda Mandelstam's book, Hope Against Hope, which was about sort of the destruction of her husband, the poet Osip Mandelstam, at the hands of the Soviet regime, and her kind of incredible analysis about the way, power was wielded and language was wielded to make people afraid of each other, to make people afraid to speak to each other, and to make people believe that they could not share anxieties, but only use them against each other, and only to be afraid of other people. And, and it's a technique that continues to be used in the world today, but she speaks about it very starkly and clearly within a very, defined context, which really highlights it, I think.
To go back to the chronology of your life, you went and studied acting in London in your late teens. Tell us a little bit about that experience, and in particular, what it taught you about writing. You've talked about that elsewhere, but I'm sure listeners would be interested to hear that.
Yeah, so when I was 17, I went to drama school in London, and it was a place called Drama Centre, which is now defunct, but at that time was quite notorious for its alternative approach to acting training, which was very much based on Stanislavski's method. And some of the teachers there had, of course, also taught with Lee Strasberg in New York, and they were kind of bringing that tradition into Britain, which kind of roundly rejected it and didn't, it kind of interfered with the classical traditions of theatre here. And so Drama Centre was quite a strange place. It was quite hardcore. You had to be there 11 hours a day and, perform many kind of peculiar, interesting exercises that were to do with teaching you how to reach parts of yourself that were useful, and that you could use to kind of build a ballast of reality at the bottom of any character. That, of course, you bring imagination to creating a character, but you also bring something of yourself which creates a sense of authenticity, which allows you then to take an informed imaginative leap, as opposed to just thinking, what is it like? I mean, it was an incredible experience for me. I really loved it. It was very, very intense. It had a very high kind of expectation of you and taught you to think about art and think about the world and to take what you did seriously, and to be very careful not to take yourself seriously within the context of that. But that, that what you did with your life is important. Those things matter. You're not just floating around doing things that are of no account to anyone, but that actually art is meaningful and a serious pursuit to have in life. And that stayed with me even after I realised that I didn't want to act.
We enjoyed the comment where you said that most of it would be illegal nowadays, which seemed a kind of ringing endorsement of it. But we thought it was interesting that you went through that experience, but then within a year of graduating, you'd abandoned the idea of acting. Was that because of the death of your brother, or what else were the factors at that point?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I think the death of my brother really brought everything that was changing inside me to the fore in a way that wouldn't have happened quite so quickly, I think. But I think I was also realizing that temperamentally I wasn't particularly suited to life as an actor, that I didn't really like to be around people all day long, which is not a great quality to have if you want to be an actor. And that also I wanted more control. I wanted to be the originator. I didn't want to be the interpreter. And I think, so much of what I loved about acting was about loving language and about loving character. And I think that created the confusion where I thought, okay, because I was also, I was a bit of a show off. So, it was like, look at me on the stage. And after my brother died, the show off bit kind of completely died. And I wanted to be as far away from the world as possible. But the love of language and character then just began to turn into something else. And I had, it's not like I hadn't been writing. I had been writing ever since I was a child, but it took that event, I suppose, to kind of push it to the fore.
How did you, once you'd had that realization that this is what you wanted to be doing, how did you kind of make your first steps in earnest in that direction?
Well, I had, in kind of grief and confusion, gone to Russia and spent a few months in Russia after my brother died. And I was kind of on my own, and I didn't really speak that much Russian. And it was obviously a time of doing a lot of thinking and going to the theatre and going to concerts, and kind of there was sort of art and there was thinking and then there was drinking, and that was pretty much what happened. And it was there that I really thought, okay, now you have to start to be serious about writing. This is the thing that you should be doing. And when I came back to London afterwards, I was broke, and I got a temping job, and I spent years temping. But what I did do was I started to get up at 5 a.m. before I would go into the temping job and write. And it was all really bad, but it was the beginning of, learning how to do it, of learning the discipline, but also kind of getting the imagination into the right region, I suppose.
Hello listeners, you may remember that a few months ago we made some improvements to our Patreon offering, refreshing our package of successful pitches for people who support Always Take Notes. Since then, we've been so delighted to see more people join up. We've loved hearing from you about how useful you found the package and the podcast, but we're really keen to keep expanding the benefits available to all the people who support us.
So with that in mind, we've added 40 new pages of material to the package, including pitches to the New York Times, the Washington Post and the BBC. This means the whole compendium now runs to a whopping 160 pages. And we're excited to announce that for people who contribute $10 a month, we're also going to start releasing bonus mini episodes. If you'd like to know what these will sound like, there's a sample episode with Lee Child that you can listen to for free on our Patreon now.
Thanks to the help of our sponsor, Scrivener, the first 10 new sign-ups at $10 per month will receive a lifelong license to Scrivener worth £55. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, academic papers, and even scripts. We're now down to 8 of them left, so if you're interested, check it out as soon as you can.
These are just a few of the updates we've made to our Patreon offering. So if you'd like to find out more about how to get your hands on an ATN mug, suggest questions for upcoming guests, or join a monthly call with us to workshop a pitch, head to www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes. That's www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes.
And thanks so much again for all your support so far. Could we talk about the kind of long gestation of The Girl is a Half-Formed Thing? So published in 2013, but you started writing in 2003. So at what point post Russia, when you're doing these temping jobs, did those kind of early writing experiments begin to coalesce into what in time would become the novel? And then talk us through its kind of long path to publication.
Girl was it didn't nothing evolved into Girl. So the writing was just sort of terrible writing and random scenes, and all the time I was sort of making notes for this novel that I imagined I was going to write at some point. And so when I was 26, my husband, my recently acquired husband at that point, got a job directing a show in Japan, and it had quite a good fee. And he said, okay, when we come back from Japan, whatever's left of this fee, that's going to be your writing time, so do it. And just before we went to Japan, our house was burgled, and the notebook with all my amazing notes was stolen because it was in my handbag. And I ran around Tottenham everywhere looking for it, and I never found it. So when we came back from Japan, there was nothing to start from. All the great ideas were gone, and all I had was time. A little bit of time, however long I could make the money work for. And so I just sat down and thought, okay, well, it's now or never. I don't really know how to do it, so I'm going to write 1,000 words a day. Something will come. And I spent about 3 weeks writing 1,000 words a day, and it was really bad, and there was nothing coming. And I just thought, oh, this is awful, and I've wasted this money. And then one day, the first words of Girl is a Hat From Thing just came out in the midst of all the terrible writing. And I just knew at that moment, it's like a sense of recognition. I just knew this was, whatever it was, this was the starting point. And I just had to go from there, and I had to follow it from there. And so, yeah, so then it was, I had about 6 months, and I did 3 drafts in 6 months, and then started to send it out into the land of rejection.
We'll get on to the land of rejection, that depressing place, soon enough. But in terms of the actual writing process, when you say you were following it, was that just on the page you were writing and seeing what happened, and then you kind of went back and played with it, rearranged it, edited it, whatever afterwards?
Yeah, so every day I would sort of write the 1,000 words, and then the next day I would reread what I had written the day before, and usually cut about 800 words, and then start from the most interesting sentence. And it was really a process of following the language, and the language sort of brought what I needed in terms of story and in terms of character. It brought it with itself, and it would just sort of appear on the page. And, I mean, for instance, because, there's the major storyline is the girl who loses her brother to a brain tumor, which was, something that I had experienced myself. And certainly had thought when I sat down to write, well, the one thing I definitely won't want to include is a story about a girl who loses her brother to a brain tumor. That would be terrible. And yet that became part of the story. And although it's not autobiographical, it's obviously is a story that I relate to in that aspect very, very closely. And I kind of knew as I was writing that whenever I would hit on something that seemed connected to that the writing got better. And that's where I had to stay close to that. And if I tried to force it away, the writing became really bad again. And there was more cutting. So it was really having to trust that I could identify what was good writing, for one thing, particularly because the nature of the writing, that it's not kind of linear sentences. And, it was writing and hoping that I was right, that this was good. Yeah, so it just grew. It grew by itself. There was no plan.
That process seems really interesting, because the classic writing a novel advice is, push on, push on, push on. Don't try and spend all your time getting the first chapter right. Were you, and when you're cutting 80% of what you've written every day, it obviously, that's, you've got to have some drive to carry on. Were you always clear that you had to go and do that edit of the existing stuff before you pushed forward?
It wasn't really a choice. It was just an instinct. I think it was just that feeling of, okay, so, because I think I started to read it back just so that I could feel that I was in the right place, kind of rhythmically and emotionally, and that I was picking up where I had left off. And that was a way of keeping it all connected up rather than sort of randomly arriving at different emotions or whatever it was. But I found it impossible to leave it alone. I couldn't just push on. If I read it and I didn't like it, it had to go. There seemed to be no point in keeping the crap for no good reason. And it's, and I still write like that today. That's not, that's just become how I do it.
I was really interested to read the influence that studying other languages has had on your own approach to language and, as you say, rhythm and kind of texture of language. With this book in particular, how conscious of that were you? How are you thinking about kind of restructuring and playing with grammar and things like that in a way that was kind of appropriate for this story, or the way that you wanted to tell this story?
You mean for A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing?
Yeah.
I suppose I didn't really think about it in technical terms. I knew that I wanted the reader to experience the book in a different way, like through a different sort of organ than the brain, and I knew that to do that you couldn't just write in the way that everyone always had, because you just end up with the same result. And it had to be about breaking and changing, and then also, the idea of rhythm was important, because I thought it would help with the reader with difficult subject matter, with difficult syntax and sentence structure. To have a sense of rhythm inside the language would help with that. And also because the subject matter was clearly becoming increasingly dark, that the prose had to have its own beauty, even if it was difficult. And so those were the things that I kind of had my eye on. But not really until maybe the second draft. The first draft was get to the end, find out what happens. And then the next two drafts were really about that, refining the language and just making sure that I felt it all clicked in together.
Could we talk now about the process of getting a publisher for the book, which was extensive and challenging, but maybe if we talk about it particularly in the context of this kind of phobia that the publishing industry has of novelty, or of stuff that is not, very similar to, the thing that won the Booker last year you've put elsewhere. Tell us about, the whole journey, how it worked, how you kept the drive to keep going at that time, and then, given you were very much vindicated afterwards, what do you think some of the broader lessons of that experience are?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much use it is anymore. It's I wrote the book 20 years ago. It got published 12 years ago. And the publishing industry of today is completely different to the publishing industry of then. I think there are other problems that writers have nowadays, and not the. But I suppose unwillingness to take a chance on something that isn't readily definable in marketing terms probably does persist still. And after A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing did become successful. So the story of it was I, sent it out for 9 years and everyone rejected it. And my husband walked into the bookshop, the Book Hive in Norwich, and started talking to Henry Late, the owner of the shop, who asked what I did, what does your wife do? And he told him the long tale of rejection, etc. And Henry said, oh, well, me and some of my friends are thinking of setting up a press. Do you think she would let us read it? And that's how the book got published. Of course I'd let them read it. And very happily. And yeah. And we, none of us, of course, thought that the book would be the kind of success that it was. It seemed unlikely. And I, for one, was just delighted to be published and to no longer be the mad person who's saying, I'm a writer, but of course is never published. So so that's how it came to be, and then it was successful. And then Galley Beggar, who had it, found it difficult to keep it in print because it was hard and they had no money, and they entered into an arrangement with Faber. Faber sort of took over that aspect of it. And I think in the kind of the life after that, in the sort of the 10 years after that, Girl did open a lot of doors. I think there was a period certainly when suddenly everyone was scrabbling around for, okay, what weird books can we find that can, it's the same problem, isn't it? Like what can we find that can replicate the success of this thing? Or we'll find something else that's just like it but a bit different. And, but I think at that point, indie presses suddenly had a revival of interest. There seemed to be a lot of indie presses coming to the fore at that point as well, and bringing lots of writers with them. And, I think it did change the atmosphere around writing and around kind of alternative types of writing for quite a few years.
When you saw critics describing it as radically experimental, were you quite amused by that? I mean, obviously you want to do something different with the prose, but I think I saw somewhere that that you felt that critics' reaction was as if James Joyce had kind of never existed, and that stream of consciousness narratives, had been done, but it was just doing it in a slightly different way. I mean, what was your reaction to the kind of the fact that people did find it very, very novel?
Yeah, I mean, of course I was delighted, because, it's always good to frighten the horses. And but I did also find it extremely strange that people seem to think that this was so new that nothing had ever been like it before, whereas for me it was very clearly coming out of a tradition that perhaps had been in abeyance for a while. But Beckett only died in 1989, so it's not like we're talking about hundreds of years where no modernist experimentation existed in writing. And so it seemed strange to me, but perhaps that was a sign of how far the critical industry had moved away from, in some ways, a serious engagement with what the possibilities of the novel, and we're really just involved in like what's the hot shit now.
I mean, it had a really hugely glowing reception. It won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, the Goldsmith Prize, the Folio Prize, the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, the Kerry Group Irish Fiction Award, etc. We often, with writers who've had a smash on the podcast, we ask them, what set of factors do they think really led to a book to catch fire? And often they find it very difficult to say. It's hard to pin it down to one thing. I mean, as you were going through this experience, what were there particular moments that you think were really pivotal to the reception it got, or was it a slow build, or kind of tell us what looking back you think drove this?
Well, one thing I should say, I did not win the Folio Prize. I was shortlisted for it. I don't want to claim it, but I think it was more to do with a kind of a sense of excitement in an industry that had grown rather weary with the cynicism of publishing at that period. I think that publishing was very anxious about the internet, very afraid of what was going to happen with the world of online and books, and having seen what Napster had done to the music industry, had, I think, just kind of doubled down on their caution about anything that might lose them money. And so in a way it was, I think when the book finally did get there, everyone was ready for it. I think critics were interested in something that was different, that was going to ask something else of them. Readers, had, been sort of talked down to by the industry, I think, for quite a long time, and sort of fed those rather sort of banal middlebrow novels that were all supposed to take terribly seriously as high literature. And I think readers were ready for something else. Readers were open to having, more things asked of them. I think that, there is a problem, there was then and is now still a problem of, being afraid of readers, being afraid of not pleasing readers. And actually, I think there are lots of readers who quite keen on not being pleased, who are happy to work a bit harder, who like to involve themselves in the reading process, who don't just want to have a passive experience like watching TV, but are happy to engage and to be, challenged with material that looks a bit strange on the page.
Absolutely. You mentioned that little kind of pot of money that helped you start on the novel. Once the novel was published and had this, great reception, how did it change things for you financially at that point?
Oh, I mean, like I won a load of prizes. That was great. And that made life easier. And also, then people were volunteering to buy Lesser Bohemians, which I had already been working on for about 5 years by the time Girl came out. And that made life easier. And then all those things that happen when you're published, where you're invited to festivals or you're asked to give addresses or lectures or teaching or whatever, suddenly, I was able to earn a living, which, had seemed completely inconceivable to me before that. And that's, there's a lot of admin that comes with having a career as opposed to just writing. And I hadn't really anticipated that and how much that can eat into the writing life. But I would certainly recommend being published and paid for it over not being published and not getting paid.
What was it like following it up? The Lesser Bohemians took 9 years to write. I was interested to hear that you were deep into it by the time it started. But from this situation of working on a novel that no one wanted to look at or interested, to suddenly having ridden this big success, what was that like emotionally and creatively?
Well, I think it was a little daunting at first. Because of course there's so many unhelpful, glowing reviews of Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing, which then finished up with, "She'll never write anything as good again." I go, great, thanks so much. Great that you're so sure you've read one thing. And so I was a bit freaked out, but then I remembered that I was, 5 years into Lesser Bohemians, and that I had started writing that novel in the midst of all the failure, and not knowing if I would ever be published, if Girl would ever be published, if Lesser Bohemians would be published, if anything would ever happen, if perhaps I was just writing another book for the drawer. And I think that helped, that I just thought, well, I was writing in failure, so I think I'll just keep on going in success. And it's, you keep when you're writing in failure, you're trying to keep the voice of rejection out of the room while you're working. And when you're writing success, you're trying to keep the voice of everyone who thinks they know what you should be doing out of the room as well. And so it's in some ways a similar sort of process.
That's a good way of putting it. In terms of creating characters, I mean, with the Less Bohemians and Eileen and Stephen, I mean, how did they come to you just kind of fully formed? Do you have any methods for creating characters? I mean, how do you kind of conceptualize that crucial part of your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Lesser Bohemians again just began from the impulse try. I knew it was time to sit down and start working on something else, but I didn't know what, and I didn't know who it would be about. All I had was language, and it began, and that's why Lesser Bohemians begins in a similar linguistic place to where Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing ends, that language is quite broken and quite separated out. And slowly, as I wrote, Eileen began to emerge. And then even more slowly, Stephen began to emerge. And then the language began to change, because it became clear to me that Eileen was a very different type of girl to the girl from A Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing, that this was a character who would survive, who could make connections in the world, who could kind of become herself. The girl who would not be half-formed, but would become fully formed. And language began to link up. Because of that, just logically, it started to create, the book began to create its own language for this other kind of character, because the whole book is really seen through her inner experience, apart from the section when Stephen sort of tells his life story in this kind of Victorian, and here's my life story kind of monologue. But even that is told not through his consciousness, but through Eileen's experience of what he's saying. So it's written very carefully in the language of a man who is telling the story, but you're never privy to his inner thoughts or his inner experience while he's telling this story. All you get is what Eileen hears and what she sees. And so it just, character came out of the language. Once again, I have no sort of rules about it, other than once you begin to feel the character and begin to understand who they are, you have to then always be bringing all of them with you as you're writing, that you have to keep the logic of those characters really at the forefront of your mind at all times, and the way that language makes them think, or the way that they make language work as a result of how they think and how they experience the world. So yeah, I have no hot tips on creating character.
We saw also that an early draft of the Lesser Bohemians was 800 pages long. What was your process for boiling that down?
Well, I got to the end of the sort of 800 pages, and I realised that I had written the biggest sketch for a novel that anyone had ever written, possibly. And it was very detailed. Everything that happened was explored right down to its minutiae. And I needed it to really feel that I understood who these people were and what was happening to them and what was happening between them. But once I got to the end of this giant draft, I also knew that the reader would find it incredibly tedious, and that all the detail was now alive inside me, and so would transfer without me having to describe every single thing the way I had in that. And so the process was really, the editing process was just to go back to the beginning and cut. And so by the time I got to 800 pages, there's quite a few years of writing in there. And I wasn't reading everything from the beginning the whole way through. So it had been, a long time since I had read the beginning of the book. And I just decided that if I don't remember something, I was going to cut it. That everything important to the story I will remember. It will make sense to me. It will have to stay. And everything that I don't remember just goes in the bin. And that was actually relatively straightforward. I mean, it was time consuming, but it was quite straightforward.
It's a pretty I mean, it makes sense as a system. It's sort of like the narrative equivalent of the spark joy phenomenon. Am I right in thinking that you adapted The Last Bohemians into a film?
Yes, that's right.
What's the kind of status of that? I think I saw that on the British Film Council website that it was in pre-production, but that is obviously a term that encompasses many different states. So yeah,
I think that is a deceptive state. I think we are the script is finished, and yeah, it's in the kind of the looking for the money stage of the game now. Yeah, and I mean, again, that the script took a long time, and then also, I decided that I wanted to direct it, and so then I had to go away and write and direct a short film because I had no experience of filmmaking at all, and so that also then took up quite a long time. But yes, and now I'm at the end of that process too. So yeah, it's kind of looking for money now.
We saw as well that you'd had this quite wry comment about your loathing of sort of wafty female protagonists. Could you talk about that maybe in the context of Strange Hotel and this idea of writing about a woman who's old enough to have a bit more agency in how she reacts and engages with the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, I think Strange Hotel for me is a really interesting and peculiar book, and how it came about because it sort of wedged itself in between Lesser Bohemians and The City Changes Its Face. And it came about because I had a fellowship to work in Beckett's archive. And that was obviously quite intense, reading a lot of Beckett all the time. So I just started to write something else in order to escape the misery of Beckett. And then, of course, by the time I got to the end of Strange Hotel, I was like, oh, Jesus, I've actually written the most Beckettian novel I could possibly have written. But it was a real kind of change for me to not write a young female protagonist and to think about how language is changed by the age of the protagonist. And I think, the kind of the loathing of wafty female protagonists is people who are wandering around who don't know anything about themselves. They can't tell what they want, and they don't want anything, and they're just waiting for things to happen to them. And that's, I find, the most sort of unbearable idea if that's what women are like. And it's very fashionable and it's very tiresome. And so I really wanted to write a sort of a middle-aged woman that wasn't about being a mother, which I think is also the expectation. If you're writing about middle-aged women, it's always got to be about, oh, they have children, or oh, they can't have children, and that's all that middle-aged women think about. And so, I wrote this novel about a woman who goes to 6 different hotel rooms around the world, and you don't know why. And the rule of the novel was you never see her outside the room, because it's a book about thinking of what it is to be a person, that wherever you go, however exciting the location, you're in Austin, Texas, or you're in Oslo, or you're in Auckland, or, you're in Prague, when you're sat in a hotel room on your own at night, it's just you and the you that you can't escape. And the character is also particularly prickly because she is someone who doesn't want to engage with emotion, isn't someone who's interested in thinking about her inner life, and who's someone who wants to protect herself from memory, from pain, the way, of course, you do as you get older. When you're young, you kind of allow things to happen, or certainly in my generation, you encouraged experience. You went out into the world and you wanted things to happen and to be changed and to be affected. And as you get older, you are more protective of yourself. You're like, I don't really want to, break myself at this moment. I want to keep away the things that are painful and protect myself from memories that might upset me. And so that had, again, in its own way, really, really affected the language of the novel. It really insisted that the protagonist use language as a way to keep people as far away as possible. So for the first time, I was writing very, very long, linear sentences, grammatically correct, many subclauses, as much correct punctuation as I could possibly load into it, all in aid of really making the language force the reader away, to not allow the reader in towards the emotion. And it's there, but they have to work quite hard to get to it. But she doesn't want them to come in. She doesn't want to let anyone in. She doesn't even want to let herself in. And so in some ways it's a very elusive kind of novel, and she is not necessarily a lovable character. You know, she is someone who doesn't want to allow you access to herself. And so it was quite fun to really reverse the use of language, instead of using it as a means of creating intimacy between the character and the reader, using language as a weapon that the character uses to keep the reader out. And it was also quite, you know, I mean, there was a bit of the devil in me, which was had been so much discussion about the difficulty, the supposed difficulty of the first two novels and the language of that. And, you know, it was hard work for the reader. And I just thought, well, you know, I wonder if I use completely grammatically correct language, will that help? Or can that also be a way of keeping people out? A way of causing difficulty, a way of making it hard for people to understand. I mean, look at academic writing. Right? I mean, it's all about something, but it does not let you in. And it was, you know, a way of playing with that. So it was an interesting departure, and it was a bit of a palate cleanser, I think, between Lesser Bohemians and The City Changes Its Face.
How did you walk that line between writing a character that's, you know, withholding and kind of keeping readers out, as you say, and then the reader's impulse, which is kind of desperate to get under the skin of a character? How do you kind of balance those two, you know, aspects of the narrative and the reader's experience?
Well, I suppose I knew that I was making it hard for the reader, and that, you know, most people would come to my book expecting to have a sort of big emotional experience the way they get from Girl or from Lesser Bohemians. And that it would be tricky for people to suddenly be forced on the outside, to not be allowed in, not be invited into the private space. And it was really, you know, it was just trial and error, I suppose. The thing is, it's there, the emotion is there, but you have to work quite hard to get to it. And there's only kind of, because also, you know, you're not allowed into almost any kind of traditional aspects of storytelling and plot. And, you know, and the last, you have to wait to the end of the novel, where the last hotel room is the hotel room that she imagines. That she might, if she had made a different choice in her life, she might have ended up in that hotel room. And what would her life have been like if she had gone that left instead of right? And that's kind of where the emotion lies in it. But I think, you know, and I think some people do find it a very hard novel as a result of that. And some people really get it and some people don't.
We're coming up towards the end of our time, but a final question from me. You've talked elsewhere about the pressure from on women writers to divulge personal things about themselves in their writing, and the kind of different ways that they are pressured into putting stuff out there. Could you talk a bit about that, maybe in the context of Something Out of Place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an expectation that, well, you know, there's the old chestnut, which is that sort of women lack imagination, and therefore everything that they write in their fiction must necessarily come from their personal experience. And, you know, and I know that I muddy the waters with that, because there are lots of elements in my novels which I'm quite happy to say, you know, like Lesser Bohemians, yes, I was at drama school in Camden in the 90s, or with Girl, yes, I did have a brother also who died in that way. And that invites those kind of comparisons in, but also all of my novels are acts of imagination, or acts of fiction. And I mean, I think that the real culprit is the personal essay, which, you know, men are sort of allowed to write about great subjects, and women are supposed to talk about, you know, their feelings of shame about not being a good enough mother or some shit. And then you get critics who just cannot allow, you know, any personal aspect that appears in a novel to go unpunished. You know, that it's got to be you. It's got to you're divulging yourself in some way, and therefore they are allowed to make all of these assumptions about you. I think with City Changes Its Face, I don't know specifically. I feel as though it's moved off in its own direction, but it also, of course, it does have personal elements. It has Stephen's film in it, which is something I couldn't have written if I hadn't written and directed my own short film. I wouldn't have understood making film in that way. But also, I don't think that necessarily feeds into that idea about women. I mean, I don't feel pressured, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say at the end of the day. I don't feel obliged to feed that monster or to engage with it. And I feel a bit sorry for women when they do. And also some women do it cynically, and good for them, and why not? But it's a world that I want to stay away from entirely.
That's fair enough. Me too. I wanted to end by asking you about a very funny diktat that you shared, which was that the idea of writing for yourself is sort of a fallacy for writers of all kinds. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you write for yourself that shows that you're a true purist or something. But the truth is, and I know this from personal experience, you don't write to not be published. You don't write for the drawer. You always want it to go out into the world and have a life outside of you. Why else are you doing it? Otherwise it's a diary, right? That is writing for yourself. But that is not to say that I don't think of the reader, or that I don't try and please the reader when I'm writing. I'm not thinking, okay, what do readers want to hear about? I'm going to write a story about X, Y, Z, and I'm going to give them, and Stranger Tale is very much like the most obtuse and obstreperous thing I possibly could have done to a reader. But I do think about being read when I'm writing. I do want to make the work available to people. I don't want it to feel enclosed. I don't want to be Gertrude Stein and write things that are so idiosyncratic and personal that unless you have a PhD in me, you can't understand what it's about. So I am conscious all the time of opening the text, of allowing and hopefully allowing space for the reader to come in and bring their own interpretation. And I also have to accept that the nature of the way I write means that they will have their own interpretations, because I'm not telling them in black and white, it's this, and this. I'm more often sort of showing an impression of something and allowing them to experience it and then think what they like about it. So, I think it's very tricky, because at the moment, for instance, when I'm doing book touring with City Changes Its Face, we get a lot of questions from students about how do you deal with what the requirements of the market, and how much should you deal with the requirements of the market when you are writing. And I think that you should not, and that you cannot, and that if you do, you already create failure inside your work, because you can't possibly know how the market is going to respond. Not ever, not really. But I think there is a lot of pressure on younger writers to involve themselves in marketing and to write towards a marketing end.
Well, look, thank you, Eimear, for a fascinating and broad-ranging conversation, and wishing you all the best with The City Changes Its Face and with everything else going forward.
Thank you very much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Eimear McBride. She doesn't have social media or a website, but The City Changes Its Face is published by Faber and Faber. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Eimear?
I enjoyed speaking to her a lot. I remember, I think at some point shortly after you did the interview, I think you or I said, I think you did, Irish novelists are good guests. And that is something that we have found. There's definitely delving deep into cliches, but the crack I thought was quite high level, and a bit similar to the kind of chat we had with Kevin Barry. So a kind of wry sense of humor. I think more widely the thing that stuck with me was the sort of frightening drama institution that she went to and survived, but also how the kind of travails that she had of writing a novel that was formally more inventive, that didn't easily fit in a box, and the difficulties of selling that, and her kind of skepticism, and I think well earned, of a publishing industry that is often very keen to try and recreate what has worked and very wary of doing something different. What did you think?
Yes, absolutely. It's sort of one of those, fit into that category of writers who have kind of come good in the end after having toiled and suffered lots of rejections, and it's been very dispiriting for them, but it's great that they've persisted and kind of won the acclaim that they deserve. And as you say, I think it was a great addition to our roster of novelists, both Irish and non-Irish. Eimear was both entertaining and deeply thoughtful about her craft. And I found her reflections on the importance of reading in translation and studying other languages really interesting as well. I know it's something that you care deeply about, Simon, and it's something we've touched on with other writers before, but it's clear with her that it's had a huge influence on her style and voice. So I thought it was fascinating to touch on that.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on X at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.